the overall situation in Syria, of course, is really a tragedy, a human tragedy on a very large scale. More or less half the population has been displaced in some way or another, and a very large number of casualties, and of course including deaths, fatal casualties. So that is definitely the sort of scale and length of the conflict there is very preoccupying, and is bound to be the first thing that one mentions. But then, it has become a very complicated situation, and certainly an American colleague of mine has described it as the most complicated situation that he has ever really confronted in a long career of his own. And
people are banding around the term World War III. Is that relevant at this stage?
Of course, I hope not. I think people have got to be careful about the language. It's true, you're quite right. That is being used as an easy expression. But I think people are saying that they're not quite thinking through what that means.
But the situation that we find ourselves in currently is unprecedented?
Well, the problem, there are many problems in Syria, as I've already indicated, but one particular feature of the situation there is that a lot of outside powers have become involved, either regional powers or sort of major international powers. And all those powers have got their own objectives, and they're not necessarily the same as either the Syrian government or the Syrian opposition. So there are a lot of different players involved. And of course, if you have major outside power involvement, then that increases the risk biologically of turning something which is local, however vicious in its basic impact, into something which can run the risk of a much more major confrontation. Which then has much wider international implications. So, some people would argue that a key reason why it hasn't been possible to find a settlement in Syria is that there are too many outside powers involved. But certainly it increases the complexity of the situation and increases the range of risks which are there, self-evidently, including the ones that we face at the moment.
As we've discussed, you spent some of your career in Russia, and Russia is backing the Syrian government here. What is their particular motivation?
Well, the Russian government has backed the government of President Assad from the very beginning of the upheaval in Syria in 2011. And their position has been has been clearly stated. This is the recognised government of Syria. It's had international legitimacy, which was the case in 2011, and it isn't the job of anybody outside the country to come in and upset that. And there is, a wider interest, and certainly an important Russian interest, because Russia and the Soviet Union before it was a long-standing and is a long-standing ally of Syria, both Syria of President Assad and of Assad's father. The official position of the Russian authorities is that it must be clear that it's not possible and not acceptable for outside powers to intervene in the affairs of sovereign countries, even if you don't like them.
Saying that, though, isn't this all just about the power and influence of Russian President Vladimir Putin?
I think it's more complicated than that. From his point of view, there is a principle involved. I mean, I'm obviously repeating what he himself would say, but I think he would say that there is but he does say that there's an important principle involved, which is recognising the legitimacy of recognised governments.
What does Syria have to offer Russia?
Well, Syria is a very long-standing ally of Russia, going back to the 1980s. Of course, it has offered military bases, naval and air bases. And that is, some experts and analysts would say that is the major reason why Russia wants to be involved there. I think it's more complicated than that. Russia's influence and the Soviet Union's influence in the Middle East had been greatly reduced over the years, and really reduced to almost nothing. And its one solid remaining ally was Syria. Therefore, solidifying that alliance, making sure that the government survived in the face of upheaval and rebellion, is consistent with Russia's interests as defined by the Kremlin.
How do you think this will play out? Slowly. I
think slowly. I've never really been able to see a way through, and I can't now see how this will evolve. I don't see, in present circumstances, how a political settlement can be reached or a diplomatic solution can be reached, and I don't believe a military solution can be reached fully either, which covers and protects the whole of Syria and the whole of Syrian population.
Well, this is very concerning then.
It's been concerning for 7.5 years. Yeah, it's changed its shape in that time. And of course, in the last 2 or 3 years, the regime and Assad have strengthened their position and recovered quite a lot of territory with powerful Russian assistance. But that, it doesn't mean to say that the process is over or that the war and the fighting is going to be over. There are still many, many areas which are not under Syrian government control.
Have you ever seen anything like this before in your career?
Well, I've seen plenty of complicated situations, but obviously it's a bad one. I can't easily say whether it's the worst. I'm not saying it's the worst. I mean, so many difficult situations, but it's certainly very complicated. And certainly the killing and the human suffering is on the scale which is, quite something.
It's also been confirmed recently that the Russian nerve agent Novichok was used on the former double spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter in the United Kingdom. How do you think relations between Russia and the United Kingdom could now develop on this point? Well, obviously, they're difficult at the moment. You don't need me to tell you that. That is clearly the case. And there's a lot of understanding or misunderstanding which has to be overcome. And a lot of explanation is going to have to be done as to how this situation developed in this way. I don't think I would say more than that. But as always in these situations, however tense they become, it is necessary to keep on talking. It is necessary to have. But they certainly can't do that if they've expelled each other's diplomats.
Yeah, they haven't expelled everybody. They haven't broken off diplomatic relations. Diplomatic relations remain open. Embassies remain in place. There are still a lot of diplomats and officials in each country, and there are many ways in today's world how you can keep in touch with people. You don't have to rely on traditional embassies. Twitter, for example, like President Trump. Well, that's one example, yes. We'll get on to that in a moment, but I'm wondering how Brexit may affect Britain in the future and her ability to protect herself, and does it leave her more open to attack, or does it leave her more exposed without Europe behind her? Well, it isn't the case that Europe is not behind her. As indeed the Prime Minister has made clear, we are, the government is working hard to reinforce and pursue a very close security and defence relationship with European countries, European partners, and of course we all remain part of NATO. And there are multiple links. And everybody is determined to maintain a dynamic and really a constructive security and defence relationship. Of course, there are details that have to be talked through and adaptations that are going to have to be made. But I've been very struck by the sincere and constructive approach that people on all sides are taking to this. And the position of the British government, I mean, I'm not an official, I'm not a representative of the government, but the position of the the British government is very clear about this, and was a major theme of the speech the Prime Minister made at the Munich Security Conference in the middle of February. Well, obviously, it only makes sense to give advice on issues where you're well informed and you know what you're talking about. And so in effect, someone like me is an international relations advisor, and one seeks to explain, let's say, much of the time, not always, geopolitical trends and likely developments and current developments, and interpret them. I mean, there are plenty of geopolitical issues going on at the moment, and they're quite complicated, and they need interpretation, and they are often very relevant to large international businesses. And so, again, someone like me, maybe can be a useful advisor on those issues for large international corporations.
And what are some of their concerns?
Well, the most obvious one is there some political development, or either actual or potential political development, which, if it carries on, is going to affect the business climate. I mean, to take an obvious example, the upheaval of events in the Middle East, in North Africa and the Levant in 2011 clearly had an immediate impact on investment. Libya being an obvious case, Syria actually being another obvious case. I mean, those are extreme examples of it, but I think probably quite a few people around the world might have wished that they had, predicted those events coming. And so that's the most obvious recent example of the interaction between politics, if you like, and political developments and investment interests and sort of business climate.
And you bridge that gap, basically. You bridge those two sides.
It would be a big claim to make that one bridges that gap, but one tries to sort of give advice which helps. At the end of the day, business leaders have to take decisions for themselves. They have to think issues through themselves, and then they have to take the overall decision. That's not the job of an advisor. But what they also need to do is make sure they are getting advice from across a range of factors, from relevant experts, if you like, and then they can decide what to do. And political instability of any kind, including in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, of course, former Soviet Union and so on, the kind of events and unexpected events which happened in 2014, for example, also has an impact on investment. Sanctions have an impact on investment, all these issues.
What are some of the challenges that you can perhaps foresee coming in the future?
Well, of course, like everybody else, I clearly am concerned about a range of issues of stability across North Africa and Levant. The Middle East is not quite the right term for it. It's Levant and North Africa. And they can take the form either of instability and uncertainty within states or established states, which is self-evidently the case at the moment, or it can take the form of rivalry between states, which could possibly have financial and commercial consequences, or worse, could turn into real military conflict in the worst case. And so, I mean, that's an obvious thing to say. But it's not the only area of the world which has instability. And of course, in Northeast Asia, if we had been talking like this 4 months ago, we would have been talking already about North Korea. That's slightly...
We still will be talking about North Korea.
But still, it would have been top of the list, probably.
Yes.
And it isn't quite at the moment, because other things have moved to the front, and because people are a bit more relaxed about North Korea, because it seems to have calmed down a bit. Well, now, has it really, or has it not? You have to think about something the whole time and talk about it, investigate it, and yourself get expert advice, and then reach a judgment on it. But it's another example of that. And I mean, clearly there are issues in the subcontinent, which of course we know about, And there are issues, as I've already indicated, in Central and Eastern Europe.
You're here in Switzerland, beautiful Lucerne out the window.
Yes, it seems all right here.
What is our position here? I mean, are we still an important negotiator? Are we still a neutral ground? How do you see Switzerland's role in this world?
Well, okay, that's a good question. I mean, I think the two most obvious things to say is that Switzerland sets a very powerful and positive example, of a successful country, with quite a complicated history, and having to bring together a range of different traditions, different countries, different nationalities, different languages, and of course, it's been remarkably successful in doing that, and generating a powerful and successful economy which benefits everybody at the same time. So that's setting out, a powerful example and message. At the same time, it's obviously a country where it's possible to base international diplomatic and constructive and positive diplomatic activity. I mean, Geneva being the obvious case in point. But it is a centre for a whole range of international fora and international activities. And it's a neutral place in that sense. And of course, that brings advantages. So basically, it's very valuable.
How do you think international relations have changed over the years since you were obviously actually working for the intelligence services? And how do you see things now? How quickly are things changing? We mentioned earlier that, that we don't just need to talk through diplomats, and we mentioned Donald Trump using Twitter to get his messages across. I mean, how is international relations changing?
Well, in terms of the way in which the world is sort of structured, until a very short time ago, someone like me would probably have said, well, we used to think about great power relations, great power rivalries, post-Cold War or immediately post-Cold War manoeuvring between traditional great powers, nation states. Then that sort of subsided in the post-Cold War period, and we began to worry about non-state actors, terrorist groups, international extremist groups, and so on. And that, of course, was a very powerful feature of my final years in my profession. They haven't gone away. International terrorism is, of course, very much a preoccupation, although it's evolving the whole time. It keeps on changing. But it looks like tense, great power rivalry and nation-state manoeuvring has come back. So we've now got both.
Why do you think
together.
that's happened?
Well, it probably was inevitable. At the end of the day, for all the talk about globalization, the world is structured and based around nation states, and many of them have long, complicated histories. In those sorts of ways, the world will be recognizable now to people 50 or 100 years ago or whatever. Everybody has their own definition of what's important. And what
President
matters.
Trump is all for this America first.
Yeah.
Not necessarily America alone, as we've been hearing, but there's this kind of protectionist view. Is that kind of perpetuating that nation-state idea? I mean, how is he impacting global dynamics?
Well, there's on the one hand, you can look at it in headline terms, and in terms of the simple things that are said, including some of the messages and tweets. On the other hand, you can look at the reality of what actually happens day by day, and there's a great deal of continuity in American policy. Of course, there are elements in the political dynamic and rhetoric of more open nationalism, if you like, from a country which has been, for decades, the key global leader, and in many ways still is the key global leader. People talk about the decline of the United States, and then they go on and spend all their time talking about it. And if it really was declining and becoming less relevant, why do they spend all their time talking about it? I mean, that is in a way the point. There is a degree of uncertainty at the moment, around the world, because what happens in America and what happens with US policy matters to everybody. There isn't a country or a society anywhere which isn't going to worry if they think they're uncertain or they feel uncertain about the future of US policy. But maybe they shouldn't be uncertain.
Trump was particularly vocal about North Korea when it came to the WannaCry cybersecurity incident. Do you believe that North Korea has these capabilities?
Well, that was an official acknowledgement that North Korea was responsible for WannaCry. Of course, it was a failed attack. It was a ransomware attack which didn't work. But the whole point about cyber dimension, about digital dimension, about technology change, is that it's a great leveler. You can be one of the smallest and least successful countries in the world, and you can have one of the smallest economies, but the digital revolution might give you the possibility of challenging, in some way, the most powerful countries in the world. And,
so we should be concerned?
Oh, yes, of course, yes. Partly because it's new and it's hard to understand because we're having to adapt all the time, partly because the evidence shows that it can cause a great deal of damage.
And how do intelligence services kind of use the digitalization of this world now to make an impact?
Well, intelligence services are there to gain information. They're there to be well informed. They're there to have good intelligence. And if you have to have, now, given the way information flows, given the way people communicate, given the way people take decisions, given the way terrorists plan their attacks and make contact with each other and all the rest of it, the transformation in the communications environment is so big and so important that obviously intelligence services have to have capabilities which can deal with that. And the best services, in which I would certainly include our own, have to be at the very cutting edge of that. And actually, they are at the very cutting edge of that, and they always have been, ever since the famous days of the Second World War, with the achievements of Bletchley Park,
of course,
about which I know something, of course.
Yes, you do. And in the future, further in the future, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, how do you think that will impact?
Well, it's a more dynamic version of the same phenomenon, really. I mean, we're just dealing with a period of very, very rapid change. And so when people talk about, and I quite often say this, when people talk about how the world is never been more unstable and more unpredictable, I tend to push back and say, well, there have been plenty of times when the world has been much more unstable than it is now. You must keep your historical perspective. But what is different now is that change happens so fast, and by definition, change is unsettling for people, because it makes it even more difficult to predict. It's always difficult to predict the future, and the future is unpredictable. But it makes it even more difficult if change happens very rapidly. And I think that is what is unnerving people, because we've not experienced technological change. I mean, there's been great period of technological change before, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century is a very good example. But it's never been quite at the speed. And by definition, what goes very fast tends to go even faster, in 6 months' time.
Okay, so things will just get ever more quicker.
Yeah, indeed.
So, John, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.